I have many aunts and uncles, and each of them have their own creepy experiences while working at one point in their lives. The one that I remember the most is the one that told me the stories of her working late at night at an old factory in the middle of nowhere. This was before she was married. There are several incidents that had occurred in that factory regarding the paranormal. My aunt only told me 3 of them, and all of them happened in the women's bathroom. My aunt has to work during the dead hours of the night with few other female workers to help organize documents for the factory. There were only about 5 or 6 of them at work in the office area, so the rest of the factory was dead silent. One night, my aunt wanted to use the bathroom, so she left alone since the bathroom was right down the hall. As she was in there, she heard the main door open. She thought it was one of her colleagues, and then she heard the stall door at the very end slam shut. The way the stall was closed was by no means ordinary. It was a big slam, loud, intentional. It was quiet for a few seconds before another door slammed shut, equally as loud. She immediately felt a chill up her spine when she heard the third door being slammed, and when the stall door next to her slammed shut, she bolted out of there. She didn't look back or anything, and just immediately ran back to the office with her pants halfway down her legs. She indecently burst into the office, terrified, and her colleagues all stare at her. They were all there. No one had left the office ever since she had. They all asked her what's wrong, and she said that she heard something slamming the stall doors over and over. They said that they'd heard it too, but assumed it was her doing. Perhaps she was venting her frustration. She denied it and said that it wasn't her, and she's not sure who did it. But, in truth, she didn't want to know. On another occasion, another one of her colleagues was in the bathroom fixing up her hijab alone. The bathroom stalls were all open and empty, and she can see them all through the mirror except for the one at the very end. She was minding her own business, and she kept on hearing scuffling and ruffling noises coming from somewhere in the bathroom. She had heard something being torn before another odd noise. She stops and looks around to see if maybe another one of her colleagues came in without her noticing. When she saw nothing around her, she finally realized that the noise was coming from the very stall that she couldn't see inside of. Slowly and scared, she approaches the stall to see what's going on. When she reaches close enough to see inside through the mirror, her heart stops, her body goes cold, and her face turns whiter than a sheet. In the bathroom, she sees a small childlike spirit with long frizzy hair crouching over the toilet, eating away at the trash. She can see blood dripping down its hands as it devours the period pads that were in the can. Alarms went off in her head, and she immediately backed away and ran all the way back to the office and told her colleagues about the incident. Let's just say they all decided to leave earlier than usual that night. The last one is of another colleague of my aunt. She was alone in the bathroom, fixing her hair, and was about to leave when she felt a presence next to her. She turned her head and saw a woman who looked exactly like her. And when her colleagues came in to see what was wrong, the figure was gone. She decided to go home immediately after the incident. This story happened when I was in my last year of college, wherein we had to make our thesis and defend it as a requirement for graduation. Me and 2 of my friends, John and May, planned to have an overnight stay at John's house to work on our thesis. After class, we went to each of our homes to get our things for overnight, our documents, and the stuff we needed for the thesis. By 7 PM, we were all in John's house, had our dinner, and then we began typing away. We were all doing great, and came up with lots of ideas and codes for the output of our system. But by midnight, we started to feel fatigued. But none of us wanted to sleep yet. We were very much in the mood for just finishing the system we started, so we decided to tell some ghost stories to wake us up. John started and told us that sometimes in his room, in the same room that we're in now, he saw a ghostly figure standing by the corner of the room, and just look at him. Me and May looked at each other. Then, we began looking at every corner of the room. We both looked at each other again and laughed it off. We were not quite convinced of John's story, but from that we felt awake enough to continue with our system. We were working very hard, and at about 2:45, we felt sleepy again. But this time we wanted to rest by that time, so we tucked in and placed a cushion on the floor for us to sleep. We had our blanket on me, May, and then John. Just as we were all laying, May started scaring us, saying that there's someone creeping at the window, which I was closest to. John and I were not scared, and turned it against her, saying that she is also close to the window, so she can easily be reached by something outside. She got scared, stood up, and changed places with John. Now the arrangement is me, John, and May. May covered herself with a blanket, also covering her face, and then, one by one, we fell asleep. Here comes the frightening part. A few minutes later, I heard something scratching. I looked around, but there was nothing or no one there. Then I noticed that my body felt frozen. I tried moving my fingers and feet, but I seemed to be paralyzed. I tried speaking, but my mouth seemed like it was stitched together. I looked around and saw them both asleep, May still covered with the blanket. Then all of a sudden, May sat up, facing me, her whole body still being covered with a blanket. She then stood up in this weird way, stood up like she was a robot, slowly moving, and the blankets were still covering her. Then I noticed something horrifying. As I looked to my right side, I saw May at the corner end. She was still there, fast asleep. She never stood up, and her blanket was no longer covering her body. As a matter of fact, the blanket was nowhere near her. I started to realize that it wasn't May at all who had stood up. I started to freak out more, as I looked at the person or the thing covered by the blanket coming closer to me. I tried eagerly to move and scream, but to no use. It got much closer and closer, and I decided to close my eyes, and thought that maybe it would just go away. After a few seconds, I opened my eyes, and saw it just a few inches from my face, looking like it was ready to suck the life out of me. I tried to move and scream as powerfully as I could, and then I finally managed it. John woke up from my scream and tried to calm me down. I was not able to sleep again until the morning came. I told them that nightmare after we finished our thesis, for I didn't want to frighten them and get distracted by the supernatural thing that happened. I just said that I was never staying up that late again in that room. I was so tired when I got home from work. I had been working long shifts all week, and I decided that I would just fall into bed and sleep, even if it meant getting up too early in the morning. So after taking a shower, and then getting dressed for bed, I stumbled into the bathroom. I just flopped down on my bed, and I was out so fast that I didn't recall anything after me touching the bed. I didn't even close my window. And this is significant because there was an outside light directly outside my window. It basically made it half light in my room, but it didn't matter. I was tired and passed out. I don't even know what woke me. I was laying in a very awkward position, and that may have been why. I was on my side with one of my legs almost touching me on the chest. My other arm was beneath me. I felt awful, and I turned around and laid down on my back. I closed my eyes for a moment, and I thought I fell asleep. But I opened my eyes for some reason. I don't know why, but when I did, I saw a teenage boy standing at the foot of my bed. He was shaking his head for some reason and looking down at the foot of my bed. I turned and looked at the foot of my bed, and there I saw a much younger boy crouched down holding the bedpost. He had a knife in his other hand, and the evilest look on his face I had ever seen. It wasn't a smile. It was angry. Very angry. Freaked out, I screamed and got up and ran to the light switch, turning it on, looking back, and both of the boys were gone. I didn't care. I ran out of the apartment and sat in the hallway until I was able to calm down quite a bit. I didn't have anywhere else to go, and eventually went back in. I searched it and made sure no one was there. They weren't. And I slept with the lights on. I worked at a hospital, doing transport for a couple of years. The transport home base was in the basement of the hospital, where all the laundry is done, and supplies are also stored there. I hated working late nights after this incident. On this particular night, I was the only one in the basement when I heard whistling at the end of the hallway by the elevator. I poked my head around the corner, expecting to see my only co-worker on duty that night, but there was absolutely no one there. I shrugged it off. I'm not easily spooked. Nights are slow, so I ate some snacks and hung out in the break room for a bit. Next thing I know, I hear a loud bang. I walk into the hallway, and a bed is rolling down the halls, bumping into the sides. At this point, I think my co-worker is bullshitting me, so I radio him, and he says he's upstairs in the cafeteria. I still don't believe him, and think I'll catch him in the act. I walk past the laundry room, and the machines start. I pop my head in, expecting to find him there, but it's completely empty. Okay, starting to get a little nervous, I walked into the laundry room, and the machines completely stopped. I freeze, then run out and head towards the elevator, and I hear the whistling again. At this point, I know I am the only worker in the basement. As I am standing there waiting for the elevator, things start falling off the shelf down the hall. Boxes of gloves, tissues, packages of tubes. I am literally standing there, watching them fall off one by one at the opposite end of the hallway. I shit you not. My entire body broke out in goosebumps. My hair stood on the end, and I had a strong gut feeling I was being watched. I was not alone. As I was getting into the elevator, I feel what felt like someone brushing my arm. I went upstairs and found my co-worker in the cafeteria and freaked out to him. I got out of there and transferred soon after that. The creepy thing to add is that I usually whistle mindlessly to myself at work. It's almost as if the spirit was mimicking me. Creepiest feeling ever. When I was 15, my mother bought her dream house, a large Victorian on a hill, with 7 bedrooms, and much larger than the tiny 1-bedroom that we'd been living in. During the buying period, we were there several times, and I was excited to get my own room, finally. Before we could move in though, a lot of cleaning needed to be done. The previous tenants had left it feet deep in crap, clothing, and loads of other stuff we had to clear out. We hadn't lived there for very long, and then the nightmares started. They were always about ghosts. I told my mother that I thought there were ghosts in the house. She scoffed and said, "All right, I'll have my sister come." Her sister was a sensitive who could feel when spirits were present. She went through and declared it clear, but I insisted. Finally, just after New Year, we moved in. Soon after, it became apparent that I was right. Things started getting moved. You'd see things out of the corner of your eye, odd noises and smells. I'd smell whiskey in my bedroom, or chocolate cake in the kitchen. Turned out, there had been an older couple who lived there. She loved to bake, and he loved to drink, and when he had too much, his wife would make him sleep in another room, my room. Then there was the black cloud. It would follow me up the stairs at night, and stop as I went into my bedroom. As soon as the door would shut, it would come through the wall and drift in back and forth. At about this time, my depressions deepened, and I began considering suicide. The old man seemed to be more attached to my sister, who will deny anything to this day, but she would suddenly begin sleeping in the living room. I finally saw him one night. I was going from my bedroom to the bathroom, and looked through the front bedroom towards her room. In the front of the door, facing it, was this pale figure of an old man, but his face was turned towards me. The black eye sockets were staring right at me. All of a sudden, I didn't need the bathroom anymore. I sat in my room trying to figure out what I had just seen. The main one, though, we called Victoria. We saw and experienced her the most. She was a tall woman, wearing a Victorian gown, hence the name. I was up early one morning. My mother had gotten up for work and looked up the stairs and saw my sister coming down. "Both of you up before dawn? What's going on?" She waited for my sister to come down into the kitchen, in her robe and hair up in a towel. She waited and waited. She finally started calling up the stairs. My sister finally answered, and my mother asked, "Weren't you just coming down the stairs?" "No, I was sleeping," she replied. Victoria would suddenly appear in the middle of a room, drifting through it and then disappear. I would hear my mother speaking in the kitchen. "What?" I'd ask, and there would be no reply. I was just talking to the ghost. One night, I was up late writing, and I went downstairs for a cup of tea. I came up the stairs and turned to go into my room, and just as I was doing so, I glanced into my sister's room, and that's when I saw him. The old man was just there, standing in the doorway. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring as he slowly faded from view. The Victorian ghost liked to take things as well, usually jewellery or underwear, but one day I had important papers from my car insurance laid out on a table in my room. I went to deal with them, and they were gone. There was no one else in the house, At first I thought a breeze may have swept them onto the floor, but they were nowhere to be seen. Things would often be returned, either the third time you looked where the item was left, or around the third day you lost them. Sure enough, 3 days later, the insurance papers were right back on the table where I put them, except they had been folded into quarters. Many years later, my neighbour's father passed away. I went with her to the funeral and the reception at the church. Relatives gathered afterwards at the house, where we were out on the back porch jabbering away. I'm listening to my family's stories, and one of her cousins pipes up, "Who the hell are you?" My neighbour explains who I am and which house I live in, and she goes, "Oh, do you still have that tall lady ghost who stands by the window in the library?" I felt my blood turn cold. I didn't know anyone else who knew about her, let alone anyone else who called the room the library. It's actually a large walk-in closet with a window at the end, which faces the front of the house. There's a bookcase along one of the walls full of books, so our family just called it that. Little did we know, so did everyone else. I had a medicine man bless and clear the place, and those spirits are no more, but allegedly, there is a portal in the house, so things will come and go. Unfortunately, 11 years to the day of moving in, my mother lost her battle with cancer at 4:45 a.m. I was suddenly awakened, sat straight upright, and I smelt roses and felt someone standing in the doorway. "Mum, is that you?" Then I fell back asleep, my head hitting the pillow, out like a light. At 7:30 a.m, I was awoken from my sleep by a phone call from the nursing home, telling me that she had passed at night. I still live here. Though she visits me occasionally, she's never made good on her threat to haunt this place.
My grandfather died last year, sometime when my son was maybe a year old. We had dinner with the whole family every Friday, so my son had seen him several times. My grandfather was very quiet and a proud man, but when he thought he was alone or unseen, he would make silly faces at my son to get a laugh. A couple of nights after his funeral, my son, who likes to crawl into bed with us in the middle of the night, started laughing uncontrollably at 2 a.m. So I get out of the bed to go see what's going on, and find my son sitting in the middle of the living room, in the dark, laughing. Remember, it's 2 a.m. So I say, "Hey buddy, what are you doing?" He just replies, "Papa, funny." I got a little nervous for some reason and went to pick him up and bring him up to our room for the rest of the night. And as I'm hauling him away, he says, "Bye, Papa," and blows a kiss at absolutely nothing I can see.
My aunt is single and a workaholic, so she has the habit of coming home late. The latest she would usually get home is around 11 p.m, and the earliest would be about 5. She would alternate days in which she would come home early, because it wasn't exactly safe to drive home at night, especially since she lives with my grandparents, who live deep within a village, with the only roads leading into it are very long and lonely. Not to mention that she would have to drive by 2 very large lakes, as well as 2 large palm estates just to reach home. Keep in mind that hijackers nor thieves are her only concern whilst driving alone at night. Here in Malaysia, it is believed that evil spirits dwell in places with water, like lakes, oceans and rivers. So, if we pass by one at night, we are supposed to throw out a piece of small trash out of our car window, just a few meters away from our home. This is to make sure that an evil spirit does not follow us home and will only stop by that piece of trash. Don't ask me why I believe this, but I do. But my aunt doesn't do this, so of course something did end up following her home. One week, my aunt wasn't going with her original schedule of mixing up the times of going home. For 4 days straight, she drove home at exactly 11:30 p.m, except for Friday. That one night, she had to stay until 1:30 a.m. When she got home, she felt something strange. She got out of her car and felt as if she were being watched. Not just ordinary watched, like something with evil intentions was staring at her in hatred. She immediately locked her car, closed the gate, and walked straight towards the front door. As she opened it, she noticed that all the lights in the house were on, and I mean every light. She saw my two cousins who were staying over for the holidays, curled up with each other on the bed in the living room. She approached them and asked them what was wrong, as they appeared to have fear in their eyes, and they confessed that they were staying up because they thought they heard something and were getting afraid, so waited for her to arrive. My two cousins and grandmother were sitting in the kitchen where the front door is. They were talking to each other, and all were waiting for my aunt to arrive home. It was around 11 p.m. when they heard someone turn the doorknob, before inserting the key and unlocking the door. My cousins and grandmother waited for my aunt to open the door, but nothing happened. My grandmother waited and called for my aunt's name, but there was no answer. Terrified, my cousins went to turn all the lights on in the house and went to the living room to keep an eye on all the doors in the house. My grandmother went to make sure that all the doors were locked in the house. They told my aunt that they really thought it was her, because it made the exact same noises that my aunt does when she arrives home, jingling the doorknob before inserting the keys and unlocking the door and everything. My cousins thought it was someone trying to break in, but nothing else happened for the rest of the night. When my aunt told this to my mother, I felt chills around my body. My aunt says she might know who or what exactly it was, and she blames herself for it. She knew that it was one kind of evil spirit that she must have accidentally brought home from the lakes because of her consistent timing and getting home late that night during the week. Whatever followed her home mimicked exactly the way she'd done before entering the house. The good thing is that my grandmother didn't try and open the door, because if she did, she would have let in the evil spirit. And God only knows what would have happened if she actually did. Ever since that experience, she immediately resumed her normal schedule of alternating the times, because she didn't want another one following her home. After my uncle committed suicide in 2006, a couple of strange things began happening around the house. There were the typical haunting style things, like my brother insisting his stereo would turn up by itself when he was listening to music, or the time that his TV turned off all by itself. But I figure that all of it could have been chalked up to electronic interference. This particular incident, however, was just plain weird. For background, it should be noted that my uncle stayed with us about 15 years prior to his suicide. This was during the height of his drug abuse, and he slept on our couch for a few months before my mother decided to kick him out, as she had 3 young children to worry about at the time. So back to present day 2006, and my brother's friend, called John, is hanging out at our house. He was always a fairly sensitive and spiritual kind of guy, and he actually had no prior knowledge of my uncle's death. So John is sitting on the couch talking to me and my brother when he suddenly stops and says that he can feel a presence in the room. My brother and I kind of laugh at this because this is your typical John, always sensing something. But he stuns us and said, "Your uncle's sitting next to me, and he says hello." My brother and I were pretty shocked because, like I said, John had no prior knowledge of my uncle's death. Not only that, was the exact same spot that my uncle had slept on 15 years prior when he started staying with us. There is absolutely no way John could have known any of that, because it wasn't something that my brother had ever mentioned to him. Now fast forward a few years, another strange incident occurred one night when I was heading to bed. I had just turned out the light to the kitchen, and had started walking down the long hallway that leads to my bedroom. I had literally just shut my door when I hear my name being whispered. I stand there not knowing what to do. The whisper had caught me off guard because it sounded exactly like my uncle's voice. I shake it off, thinking I'm probably imagining things, and go to bed. A few days later, for whatever reason, I can't remember, I tell my mother that I thought I had heard my name being whispered, and that it sounded like my uncle. You know what she tells me next? She had actually been home one day the week before, and was in the kitchen making lunch for her and my dad, when she hears her name being called. Then she calls out to my dad, who was in the next room, and asks what he wants. He said he hadn't called out to her, and he also hadn't heard her name being called. But then he tells my mum, "Oh, you want to know something funny? I was out in the garage one day last week when no one was around, and I heard my name being called." Then Dad says that he called out and didn't hear anyone, so he went back to working on his bike, thinking nothing of it, and thought that he was just hearing things. The voice we had all heard sounded exactly like my uncle's voice. It's definitely a strange coincidence that we all heard our names being called, when we all aren't the kind of people who just hear things, and in such a short space of time with no knowledge of either event. And this was during a time when none of us had been thinking about my uncle to have the suggestion put into our heads. It was a little creepy at the time, but thinking back on it now, it's kind of nice to think that my uncle might still be around watching over us, and that it may have been his way of playing a prank on us, since he definitely had that kind of weird sense of humor when he was alive. I always felt there was something weird going on in my bedroom when I was a teenager. I thought the place was haunted. I heard noises coming from my closet all the time, and the door would randomly be opened when I entered the room, despite me knowing for a fact that I had closed it. Normally, when I told my parents about these things, they would dismiss it. I would be told that I probably forgot that I had left the door open, and that the noises I heard were just the house settling or an animal on the roof. I guess I understood why my parents didn't believe me. They didn't believe in the supernatural or anything like that. Anyway, this happened on a night that I stayed up really late doing homework. I was at my desk and working on some pretty complicated maths homework. I was up so late that I ended up falling asleep at my desk. It wasn't something that I ever did that much. I woke up, feeling disoriented at first. I was woozy, and it took a few minutes to realize that I had fallen asleep whilst doing homework. I thought I'd just get up and roll into bed and sleep for a bit. I raised up and pushed my chair out from my desk. As I moved to stand up, I was shocked when I saw a little girl crouched under my desk. She was disheveled and had a really nasty wound on her forehead. In shock, I fell backwards, knocking my chair back too, and it fell over. I never took my eyes off the girl, and she stared straight at me. Then, I struggled to get up, and when I got to my feet, she was suddenly gone. I was freaked out, but I wasn't sure what to do. I was an only child, and both of my parents worked the third shift. They wouldn't be home all night. I took the blanket off my bed, and then I went into the living room and laid down. I left a light on, covered up, and tried to go to sleep. It was hard though. I kept expecting to see her again. After a long time, I finally fell asleep without seeing her. I decided not to tell my parents about it. They would just tell me that I was dreaming or something like that. But for a long time, it was hard sleeping in my room. I kept looking at my desk every night, expecting to see her underneath it, watching me.
Number 2. I was helping another nurse with a patient that had lived a very hard life. He had numerous things going on, from cardiac to renal failure. You name it, he had it going on. This man was very much afraid to die. He never told anyone why, but I suppose everyone's afraid to die really. Every time his heart monitor beeped, he would just go into a raging scream. "Don't let me die! Don't let me die!" He clearly wasn't ready to go. At 2 a.m, his cardiac monitor starts alarming VTAC. We both rush into the room, and I am pulling the crash cart behind me. When I get to the room, the other nurse is completely white. This man was sitting about 2 inches above the bed and was laughing. His whole look had completely changed. His eyes had a look of pure evil on them, and he had the most malicious grin on his face. He laughed at us and said, "You stupid cows aren't gonna let me die, are you?" And then he laughed again. We were kind of frozen. I did reach up and hit the code blue button, and when I did, the man went into VFib. He crashed back on the bed and we started coding him. But after 20 minutes it was called. 5 minutes after the code was called, several of the cleaning team were in there doing their business when the man sits up straight in bed and says, "You let him die. Too bad," and then begins laughing maniacally. The man collapsed back into the bed, and then we heard the most horrible, agonizing scream resonate through the hallways. You could hear "Don't let me die" be whispered throughout the whole unit. Every one of the nurses that night was pale and scared. Nobody went anywhere by themselves. By morning, though, the whispering had subsided. The night shift nurses had a prayer service in the break room before we left for home. But still, we all had nightmares for weeks.